It was late March, and I was driving through the flat, endless plains of Kansas. The highway stretched out like a ribbon under the dim glow of my headlights, disappearing into the inky darkness of the horizon. I'd been on the road for nearly 6 hours, heading home after a long business trip. The clock on the dashboard blinked 11:45 p.m., and my eyelids were growing heavy. When I saw the sign for a rest stop up ahead, I decided to pull over. I wasn't keen on stopping in the middle of nowhere, but my coffee had run out hours ago, and I needed to stretch my legs. Besides, the idea of falling asleep at the wheel was far worse than a quick break. The rest stop was exactly what you'd expect, dimly lit, with a small parking lot, a vending machine, and a single, weathered restroom building. There was one other car parked at the far end of the lot, but it looked abandoned, the windows fogged over and frost clinging to the hood. I parked close to the building, leaving the engine running and my headlights on. The wind was sharp and bitter as I stepped out, cutting through my jacket like a knife. The place was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every tiny sound. My boots crunched on the gravel as I made my way to the restroom. The inside was as grim as I expected, flickering fluorescent lights, cracked tiles, and a faint smell of mildew. I splashed some cold water on my face at the sink, hoping it would jolt me awake. As I dried my hands, I noticed something strange in the mirror. Behind me, through the grimy bathroom window, I saw a man standing by my car. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The man was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hood. He stood motionless, staring at the car, or at least, I assumed he was staring. I couldn't see his face clearly. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing in the empty restroom. The figure didn't move. I quickly grabbed my keys and stepped outside, my breath visible in the cold air. The man was gone. Parking lot was empty except for my car and the abandoned one at the far end. I glanced around, the unease crawling up my spine. Deciding not to waste any more time, I climbed back into my car and locked the doors. I told myself it was nothing, probably just my overtired brain playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I pulled back onto the highway, the lights of the rest stop faded into the distance. I cranked up the radio, hoping the music would drown out my nerves. The road was empty, stretching endlessly before me, and the occasional gust of wind rattled against the windows. About 10 minutes later, I spotted something in the distance, taillights glowing faintly through the darkness. As I got closer, I realized it was the abandoned car from the rest stop, now parked on the shoulder of the highway. My stomach churned. There was no way it could have gotten here before me. I slowed down as I passed, peering into the car. The windows were still fogged, the frost still clinging to the hood. But there was something new, a shape in the driver's seat, hunched and motionless. I didn't stop. I didn't even think about stopping. I pressed down on the gas, my pulse racing as the car disappeared in my rearview mirror. The highway seemed darker now, the stars obscured by clouds. The wind howled louder, and the road began to feel unnervingly narrow, like it was closing in on me. I glanced at the clock, it was just past midnight. Then, out of nowhere, the engine sputtered. I cursed under my breath as the car slowed, the dashboard lights flickering. I managed to steer it onto the shoulder before it died completely, leaving me in total darkness. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the cooling engine. I tried the ignition again, but it wouldn't start. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. Frustrated and unnerved, I grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out to check under the hood. The wind bit at my skin as I lifted the hood, shining the flashlight over the engine. Everything looked fine, at least, as far as I could tell. I was no mechanic, but there didn't seem to be anything obviously wrong. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching on the gravel behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. At first, I saw nothing but the empty highway and the endless plains. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement, a figure standing just at the edge of the flashlight's reach. It was the same man from the rest stop. The hood still obscured his face, but I could feel his gaze, cold and unrelenting. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "Do you need something?" He didn't respond. He didn't move. My mind raced. Was he just some drifter? Someone who needed help? But if that were the case, why wasn't he saying anything? I took a step toward the car, my heart pounding. The figure took a step closer, mirroring my movement. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Then he tilted his head, as if studying me, and I saw something glint in his hand. A knife. I didn't wait to see what he'd do next. I dropped the hood and bolted for the driver's side door, slamming it shut and locking it just as he reached the car. He stood there, staring at me through the window, the knife glinting in the moonlight. I fumbled with the keys, trying the ignition again. The engine sputtered once, twice, then roared to life. I threw the car into gear and peeled out, gravel flying as I sped down the highway. I didn't stop until I reached the next town, pulling into a brightly lit gas station and collapsing against the steering wheel. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I told the attendant what had happened, and he called the local sheriff. They never found the man. The abandoned car was gone, and there were no reports of anyone matching his description in the area. To this day, I don't know who he was or what he wanted. But every time I drive late at night, I can't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there, watching, waiting. It was nearing midnight, and I was driving home from a late shift at the diner. The kind of shift that leaves you bone-tired and longing for nothing but your bed. My route home took me along a stretch of desolate, two-lane highway that cut through miles of farmland. It was the kind of road where you'd be lucky to see another car after sunset. I'd driven this route countless times before, but something about that night felt different. The air was heavy, and the dense fog that clung to the road made it feel like I was driving through a dream, or a nightmare. I cranked up the heat in my old sedan and tried to shake the eerie feeling creeping up my spine. About 10 miles into the drive, I saw him. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog. A dark shape standing at the edge of the road, motionless. As my car got closer, the figure came into focus, a man, tall and thin, wearing a tattered coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He was just standing there, staring at the road. I slowed down instinctively, but the man didn't react to my car. He didn't wave, didn't move, didn't even turn his head. Just stood there, as still as a statue. My stomach twisted in unease, and I pressed on the gas, eager to leave him behind. But as my car passed him, I caught a glimpse of his face, or rather, the lack of one. There were no features, no eyes, no mouth. Just a blank, pale surface where a face should have been. My breath caught in my throat, and I hit the gas harder, my tires squealing against the wet pavement. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just overtired. But the unease stayed with me, clinging to my thoughts like the fog to the road. I rolled down the window, hoping the cold air would snap me out of it, but the chill only made the hairs on my neck stand on end. Another 5 miles down the road, my headlights caught movement up ahead. My heart sank as I realized it was him again, standing in the exact same way, at the edge of the road. It was impossible, there was no way he could have gotten there before me. I didn't slow down this time. I gripped the steering wheel tightly and sped past him, refusing to look directly at the figure. But as I passed, I felt it, a cold, sharp presence, like something had brushed against my arm, even though the windows were closed. The fog grew thicker, and my visibility dropped to almost nothing. My car's high beams illuminated only a few feet ahead, and I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to focus on the road. That's when the knocking started. It was faint at first, like a soft tap against the back of the car. I glanced in the rearview mirror, but all I could see was darkness. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone knocking on a door. My heart raced as I realized it was coming from the trunk. I pulled over, my hands trembling as I put the car in park. The highway was silent except for the faint rustle of the wind. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of the car and walked to the back, clutching the flashlight I kept in the glove compartment. The trunk was closed, but the knocking continued, rhythmic and deliberate. My fingers fumbled with the keys as I unlocked it and lifted the lid. It was empty. I stared into the trunk, my flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated nothing but the spare tire and a few stray tools. The knocking had stopped the moment I opened it. My breath fogged in the cold air, and I slammed the trunk shut, climbing back into the car as fast as I could. I didn't care about the speed limit anymore. I just wanted to get home. The road seemed endless, the fog pressing in on all sides. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see the figure standing behind me. When I finally reached my driveway, I felt a wave of relief. My small house, with its warm porch light glowing, had never looked so inviting. I parked the car and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the house and whisper of the wind outside set me on edge. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of the figure, his blank, featureless face staring at me through the fog. The next morning, I went out to my car to leave for work. The fog had lifted, and the bright sunlight made me feel silly for being so scared. But when I reached the car, my heart sank. Scratched into the trunk's paint, in long, jagged letters, were the words, "I see you." I didn't go back to work that day. I couldn't. I spent the morning scrubbing at the scratches, trying to erase the memory of that night. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching, waiting for me to take that road again. In late spring of 2021, I took a part-time job at a fast food chain while finishing my last semester of college. The pay wasn't great, but the night shifts were quiet, giving me plenty of time to study between the occasional customer. Our location was a small, standalone building on the edge of town, bordered by an empty field on one side and a dense stretch of woods on the other. I had worked the late shift for about 2 months without incident, until that night. It was just me and my coworker Vanessa, who manned the kitchen while I took care of the counter and the drive-thru. It was a slow Tuesday, and by 11 p.m., the parking lot was deserted, the building bathed in the pale glow of the buzzing fluorescent lights. It started around midnight. Vanessa was in the back, cleaning up the fryer station, while I sat at the counter, half-heartedly flipping through my notes for an upcoming exam. The headset for the drive-thru crackled to life, startling me. "Hello," a voice said, low and rough, like someone who hadn't spoken in a while. I glanced at the monitor that showed the drive-thru lane. The screen was grainy and black and white, but it was clear, there was no car there. "Welcome to Burger Shack," I said, my voice hesitant. "Can I take your order?" There was a long pause, just the faint crackle of static on the line. Then, the voice came again, softer this time. "Do you see me?" A chill ran down my spine. I glanced back at the monitor, squinting at the empty lane. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that," I said, trying to keep my tone professional. No response. Just static. I took off the headset and walked to the window, pushing it open to peer outside. The drive-thru was empty, the field beyond it shrouded in darkness. I shut the window and locked it, telling myself it was probably a prank or a glitch in the system. But something about that voice, it didn't feel like a prank. When I told Vanessa about it, she laughed it off. "You're just tired," she said, throwing a wet towel at me playfully. "Or maybe our ghost customer got lost." I laughed with her, but the unease lingered. For the next hour, I stayed near the counter, glancing at the monitor every few minutes. The drive-thru stayed empty. Then, around 1:30 a.m., the voice came back. "Hello," it said, clearer this time, almost urgent. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The monitor still showed nothing but the empty lane. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The static crackled for a moment before the voice responded. "I'm here." I ripped off the headset and called Vanessa to the front. She rolled her eyes at my panic but put on the headset to humor me. "Hello. Anyone there?" She waited, frowning at the silence. Then her eyes widened, and she yanked the headset off. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her face pale. "What?" I said, my stomach nodding. "They said, 'I see you.'" We both stared at the monitor, but the drive-thru was still empty. Vanessa tried to brush it off, saying it was probably just interference from another radio signal, but I could see the fear in her eyes. For the next hour, we stuck together, moving around the restaurant in tense silence. Every creak of the building and hum of the appliances made us jump. The headset stayed on the counter, untouched. Around 3 a.m., we decided to start closing up early. Vanessa was taking out the trash while I wiped down the counters. The moment she stepped outside, the monitor flickered. For a brief second, I saw it, a figure standing in the drive-thru lane, tall and thin, shrouded in shadow. The screen blinked again, and it was gone. I bolted for the back door, throwing it open to call Vanessa inside. She was standing by the dumpster, staring into the field with a look of pure terror. "What's wrong?" I asked, grabbing her arm. She pointed toward the tree line. There was someone there, watching me. I dragged her back inside and locked the doors. We shut off all the lights, crouching behind the counter with our phones clutched tightly. We debated calling the police, but what would we say? That a ghost ordered food at the drive-thru? The headset crackled again. Neither of us moved. The static grew louder, filling the empty restaurant like a physical presence. Then, the voice came one last time, low and distorted. I'm inside. I didn't wait to find out what it meant. Grabbing Vanessa's arm, I yanked her toward the back exit, fumbling with the keys as we stumbled outside. We didn't stop running until we reached my car. The restaurant loomed behind us, dark and silent. We called the store manager that morning, telling him we couldn't finish our shift and explaining what had happened. He didn't seem surprised. "We've had complaints about weird stuff before," he said casually. "It's probably nothing." I never went back to that job. Vanessa quit a week later. The restaurant is still there, still open, but every time I drive past it, I can't help but shudder. I wonder if the voice ever came back, if someone else heard it, if it's still waiting for someone to answer its call. In the summer of 2020, I was traveling for work, hopping between cities for meetings and conferences. It was a grueling schedule, and by the time I reached Denver for my last stop, I was completely drained. My company had booked me a room in a modest business hotel near the airport, nothing fancy but clean and convenient. I checked in late that evening after a long day of meetings, eager to collapse into bed and get some rest before my early flight the next morning. The hotel was mostly empty, with only a few cars in the parking lot and a quiet lobby that smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning products. The clerk at the front desk handed me my key card and gave me the usual rundown of amenities. "Room 312, he said with a polite smile. "Elevators just around the corner." The elevator ride up was uneventful, the quiet hum of the machinery lulling me into a daze. When I stepped onto the third floor, the hallway stretched before me, dimly lit and lined with identical doors. It was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of your own footsteps. I found my room near the end of the hall and slipped inside, locking the door behind me. The room was standard, queen bed, desk, a small TV, and a window that overlooked the parking lot. I dropped my bag, kicked off my shoes, and flopped onto the bed, ready to let the day's stress melt away. About an hour later, just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard it, a faint knock at the door. At first, I thought it was coming from the room next door. I sat up, listening carefully, but the knock came again, louder this time. It was definitely at my door. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was just after midnight. My stomach tightened. Who would be knocking at this hour? "Hello?" I called out, my voice hesitant. No answer. The knock came again, more insistent now. I got out of bed, my heart pounding, and approached the door cautiously. Peering through the people, I saw a man standing in the hallway. He was tall and thin, wearing a rumpled suit that looked a size too big for him. His face was pale and gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. He wasn't carrying anything, no luggage, no briefcase, and he wasn't wearing a name tag or anything to suggest he worked for the hotel. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, keeping my voice steady. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, in a low, hoarse voice, he said, "I need to speak with you." "About what?" I asked, my unease growing. "I'm looking for someone," he said slowly. "I think they're in your room." His words sent a chill down my spine. "There's no one here but me," I said firmly. "You've got the wrong room." He didn't move, didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, in that same low voice, he said, "Are you sure?" The way he said it made my skin crawl. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. "I'm calling the front desk," I said loudly, hoping it would make him leave. When I reached for the phone, the knocking stopped. I froze, listening intently. The silence was deafening. I crept back to the door and looked through the peephole again, but the man was gone. The hallway was empty. Relieved but still shaken, I called the front desk and told them what had happened. The clerk sounded concerned and assured me he'd send someone up to check the floor. I thanked him and hung up, double-checking the locks on the door before climbing back into bed. But sleep wouldn't come. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind against the window, set my nerves on edge. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, the knock. It was softer this time, almost tentative, but it was enough to make my heart race. I didn't bother calling out. I went straight to the peephole, my breath catching in my throat. The man was back, but this time, he was closer. He stood just inches from the door, his face partially obscured by the peephole's distortion. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening for something. I backed away, grabbing my phone and dialing the front desk again. Before I could hit call, a soft whisper came through the door. "Let me in," the voice said, barely audible but unmistakable. I didn't respond. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. The knocking stopped again, and I thought he might have left. But when I looked through the peephole, he was still there, staring directly at me. Then, slowly, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was twisted, too wide, as if his face couldn't quite manage the expression. I stumbled back from the door, my pulse hammering in my ears. I called the front desk and told them I needed help immediately, that someone was trying to get into my room. The clerk assured me that security was on the way, but the seconds felt like hours. I stayed on the phone, clutching it like a lifeline, as I waited for the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Finally, there was a knock at the door. "Hotel security," a voice called out. I looked through the peephole, and sure enough, a uniformed guard was standing there. I opened the door just enough to explain what had happened, but when I glanced down the hallway, it was empty. There was no sign of the men. The guard checked the floor and the stairwell but found nothing. He assured me the hotel was secure and promised to keep an eye on the cameras. I nodded, though the unease in my chest hadn't lessened. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun finally rose, I packed my things and checked out as quickly as I could. The clerk at the front desk seemed genuinely concerned when I told him about the incident, but he had no explanation. The security cameras, he said, hadn't picked up anyone in the hallway during the times I mentioned. I've stayed in countless hotels since that night, but I always double-check the locks and avoid looking through peepholes unless absolutely necessary. Every so often, I think about the man in the hallway, his twisted smile and his whispered words. And I wonder what would have happened if I'd opened the door. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing.